So the final talk this morning session, actually the final talk of the session, the symposium today, is by Steve Mayfield, who is just recently moved to University of California, San Diego. Steve is an algal geneticist who worked for many years on cell signaling and many other aspects of cell regulation. And over the years, has become interested in using Plantagomonas and other algae as a platform for developing transportation fuels as an alternative to the biofuels that we generate on terrestrial plants. Last year, if you recall, Steve Long was here. Steve Long is at UC Illinois and has been working on this campus with a group at Berkeley to develop bioethanol and other feedstocks. And we haven't heard yet a talk in the symposium over the last 4 years on algae, so I'm very, very happy to.
Thanks, Paul. That's our clicker, and there's a pointer on there, too.
And there's a pointer, okay?
Right, good. So I can wander around. All right, thanks very much for having me out. Kind of wired up here. All right, well, I suppose I'd better start with the basics, because I know not everyone here knows what algae are. So algae, what's the important part of them? So a couple points that I want to leave you with. They're aquatic eukaryotic organisms that carry on photosynthesis. That means they live in the water and they convert sunlight energy into chemical energy. And that's really what we'll talk about today. I'm going to show many of the slides. Well, similar set of slides that some of the other speakers have already shown, except I'm coming from the supply side. So that means the slides are actually just as depressing, but they're just as depressing from the other side as they are from the carbon emission side. And we'll get to that. So algae are a range of microscopic, single-celled guys. They go seaweeds, obviously, some very large things. The important thing that I also want to show out here is that they're broken down into brown algae, red algae, green algae, and some dinoflagellates. And there are also photosynthetic prokaryotes. But what that means is there's an enormous diversity out there. The actual diversity, the genetic diversity inside this is bigger than all other animals and plants, higher plants combined. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. All right, so what are biofuels? So biofuels are the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy, and that is also known as photosynthesis. All right? Right now, we actually produce quite a bit of biofuels in this country. We make about 8 billion gallons of ethanol. That is almost universally produced by taking starch from corn and fermenting it into ethanol, which we then blend at about 5% in all of our gasoline. Now, as Paul said, there's also a group of people who are working on what we call cellulosic ethanol. That is taking the fibrous part of the plant, and we're thinking about converting that by degrading this cellulose into sugars, and we can also ferment that into ethanol. But it turns out you can also do something called biopower, which means you can just take it and using a very old technology called fire, we can actually convert this stuff from cellulose into electricity. But there's a third way that's come along that people have started to really look at over the last couple of years, and that is, can we do photosynthesis in non-terrestrial plants, in algae, because they will make natural oils, and then we can convert those natural oils into liquid fuels. And in fact, people say, oh, this is a great new idea. Unfortunately, this is not a new idea. All petroleum comes from this process right here. So it's actually a couple 100 million years old. We're just trying to do it in real time. Okay, but let me describe a few things first. So that's the relationship between energy and power. So what we've been talking about today a great deal is electricity. Electricity is power. Power is delivered for immediate use. So there's no storage of it. Oil is energy. Energy is stored for use at any time. And so the little picture I used to have here, but it's fallen off somehow, I used to have little power cords, little electric power lines, extension cords coming out of those. So what the difference between electricity and fuels are these are the things we're going to use to fly airplanes. It's the thing we use to drive our cars right now, but we can obviously convert that over. But we're never going to convert these over, and unlikely that we're ever going to convert over heavy trucks or boats. So there's always going to be a requirement for oil. Paul showed the slide earlier, which showed the plot of gross domestic product versus energy. So the more energy we produce, the greater our ability to increase that gross domestic product. So any form of energy that we can make, whether it's from algae, whether it's from cellulosics, whether it's from you name it, we're going to need it all in. But here's just a couple things that I want to talk about from the supply side, and these are really alarming to me over the last couple of years as I've gone through this. So really, before 1900, we did not use much petroleum. In fact, in 1901, 57% of the petroleum we used was for kerosene for lighting lamps. But then these little guys came along and we really started to burn through the stuff. Today, so in 1900s, we sold about $0.4 billion worth of petroleum. Today, that number is up to $5.8 trillion worth of petroleum worldwide. And that number is on its way up enormously, going up as the rest of the world wants to come up to our standard of living. So the primary sources of energy today, crude oil is about 36% of what we use. Most of this, as we've said, goes into transportation. Natural gas, coal, and uranium, these things go into generating electricity. And in fact, as we've been discussing today, there are other opportunities, or there are opportunities out there for generating electricity that we're going to do in the future, hopefully to displace coal and natural gas. But right now, there aren't very many good replacements for liquid petroleum. And in fact, here's the projection. Something has to fill the gap left by our shrinking oil reserves. So this is current fossil fuel reserves today by type, just for the oils. So here's conventional oil. This is the stuff we pump out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, a little bit still here in this country. We also have the tar sands. We have the extra heavy oils. These are the ones that have just been discovered down in Brazil. This is what it's projected to be by 20 and 30. So because we're running out of these reserves, we've got to fill them up with something. And in fact, people have already committed that we had better come up with a very large amount of bioenergy, of biomass in there, advanced biofuels as it's called, to replace those things. So we often hear of peak oil. And for quite a while there have been, just like there have been climate change deniers, there have also been peak oil deniers. So if we look at the world's proven reserves of oil, it's 1.4 trillion barrels today. That's an enormous number. That seems like a lot of oil. Here's where it's added up. So in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, mainly in the Saudis, we have about 7.54 billion. Add all these things up, that's where you get the 1.4 trillion. Only about 30% of that is conventional, as I said. The other 2/3 is coming from other things. But that seems like a relatively large number until you put that on an energy scale and how much we're really consuming. So today, worldwide, we consume about 15 terawatts of energy. So if we add all in, and we say, well, how much coal is there? So this is all the coal known reserves we have today. We can get about 1,013 terawatt years out of that. Oil, about 582. Natural gas, about 539. Here's the one that really alarmed me. Nuclear, something between 60 and 300. I was like, I'm sure like most people in this room, under the assumption that nuclear power went forever, or for at least a very long time. No, it turns out the way we burn it right now, the way we use it right now, which is uranium, that's a relatively limited supply. So if we add all of these reserves up, everything that we've known that's out there right now, we have about 2,194 terawatt years of energy left. As I said, we consume that at about 15 terawatts per year now, but the rest of the world is catching up with us, and by 2030 we'll be at 30 terawatt years. 30 terawatts per year, and by the end of the century we'll be at about 48. So that's just assuming a 2 to 3% growth rate. So if we add all these up and divide that by our burn rate, we will run out of all energy reserves in 2099. That to me was really alarming when this came up. This was by the International Energy Commission. These are not numbers that I have added up. You often hear in this country, oh, we have hundreds of years of coal left. Well, we have hundreds of years of coal left because we don't burn that much coal in this country, and we import 15 million barrels of oil a day. But if we cut off that, we've got about 40 years of coal left. So can this really be true? Can we really be that much out of oil? So here is, I love this one, I actually stole this one off the internet. This is oil production in the time frame from the birth of Christ to the year 2500. But you might as well say this could be from 200 million years ago. We could actually have this go back a very long way. So 1901, we started to burn this stuff. 2005, we hit our peak. We're on our way back down. We're going to burn through the stuff before the end of this century. Right? And we simply have to find a way to replace that. But you know, the oil companies, and I've talked to all of them. I've talked to Exxon and BP and everybody else, and they tell us, oh, you know, the reserves are going to go on for a long time. But here's another one that really struck me. Okay? This is past discoveries and then projected out here to future discoveries. And here's oil production, right? So what has happened is we made a huge investment in looking for oil starting in 1950 through the 1970s, and we made a lot of discoveries, although the big oil fields in Saudi Arabia and other places were already discovered back here even before 1900. All right? And over time, we've been very efficient at extracting this oil out of it. We've been getting better at that. So the productivity has continued to go up until right here in 2005, we actually hit our peak, and now we're starting down again. But if we project out to what our future discoveries are, we can see we're simply going to be out of this stuff. Here's one last thing that I want to show, which this one really brought home to me, that you know what, I believe we really are out of this. And this is called the energy return on investment. And what that means is how much energy do you get out compared to the amount of energy you had to use to get that out of the ground. So in Saudi Arabia, where the oil is very close to the ground and very high quality, that return on investment is about 100 to 1. These are the tar sands in Canada, and the return on investment in the Alberta tar sands is just dropped a little bit below 5 to 1. So the fact that we are exploiting this resource should tell you how desperate we are to get this stuff. Okay, so that was the depressing part of it. Now I'll try to give you some optimistic views of how we're actually going to replace that dwindling supply by converting to bioenergy. But the first thing we have to understand is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one state to another. So that's actually the first law of thermodynamics, right? So this is really good. We actually have a physics lesson that we brought in here. So if you can bring in a law of physics, it must be true, all right? But what that says is that actually tells us something. That tells us that every form of energy that's out there, we're not creating energy. We're simply converting it from one form to the other. So petroleum, as I said, these were deposits that came from photosynthesis, sequestered underground, and we're going to use those things, but obviously we have finite reserves and we have a greenhouse gas emission from those. First generation ethanols, which are 8 billion now, and we actually have the capacity to clearly go to 12 billion and probably to 20 billion gallons of ethanol per year. So we've got these reserves, they're out there and we can use them, but of course there's some issues on food versus fuel. Do we really want to take our food and convert it to run our cars? Second generation advanced biofuels, the cellulosics, those are coming along quite nice. The problem with that's going to be easily recoverable plant waste, and are we actually going to, do we have enough waste to really impact the amount of fuel we use? 300 billion gallons per year of petroleum is burned in this country. As we've talked before, there are electric batteries, electricity generation, and these are the batteries are for the storage. But then we run into issues of lithium and half-life. So believe it or not, if we tried to convert all our cars to electric cars, petroleum would no longer be the issue. Lithium supply would be the issue. It's actually only mined a few places in the world, Chile and South Africa. The hydrogen, we talked about the hydrogen economy. Right now that's made from electricity. And so then the last one, and that's what we're going to talk about today, which is algae. Now, algae obviously has the capacity to convert solar energy into chemical energy, so that's very nice. And what's really limiting on that? What's limiting on that is we've never gone to scale with these beasts. You know, we produce some products in it, and I'll talk about some of the things we've made in them, but we've never gone to scale, and we really don't know what the cost is yet. We have some estimates. I'll talk about what those are, but those are the really two issues. Can we get this to the same scale, to a scale that is significant for our fuel needs? Okay, so why are we going to use algae as an energy source? First of all, it has the ability to scale. Whether we can get there or not is a separate issue, but at least we know that we can look at the oceans, we can look at this stuff, and we can say, okay, we have the ability to go to scale. Obviously, at least we have the potential to get the costs down there. Sustainability, meaning that at least on our initial estimates of carbon footprint coming out of this, they look very good. They look at least as good as the cellulosics. And then the final thing is that they're actually an oil source. So we're not making a fuel like ethanol that is non-fungible that we would have to develop a new infrastructure for. We actually make oils out of here that are perfectly fungible, meaning that they drop right into our existing structure. Okay, so as I said, biofuels are the biological conversion of sunlight energy into chemical energy. So we're taking sunlight, we're sequestering CO2, we're using nutrients. That's going to become very important. And from that, we can actually make chemical energy. And that chemical energy can be in the form of carbohydrates, proteins, or hydrocarbons. Obviously, this is food. This is fuel. There's no difference between the two of these. Every debate we have out there that says, oh, is it food or is it fuel? Even in algae, the debate will really come down to food versus fuel because we can make it either one of these or chemical energy, and they're simply interconvertible between them. Okay, so here's actually the most optimistic slide that I have, right? And what that says is the world consumes 15 terawatts of energy every year. 85% of that is in fossil fuel. Here's the really good news. The sun provides 86,000 terawatts of energy every year falls on the planet. Well, if you do the simple math, that says we just need to get 0.0001% conversion, and we are there. We have solved our problem, right? But obviously, as you can see, what some of the problems are is that a lot of that sunlight is landing out in places we can't use it, and even in the places where there is adequate sunlight, something else is going to be rate limiting, and that's what we'll talk about now. And what those rate limiting things are going to be: nutrient, water, etc. Okay, so how do we convert sunlight into chemical energy with algae? Well, first of all, we grow it. Obviously, it's not going to be on this scale. When we really talk about biofuels, these happen to be in bags at a startup company in San Diego called Sapphire Energy, of which I am a founder of. We extract, we concentrate the algae, we extract the oil out of it, we concentrate that oil, and then we can convert it straight into fungible fuels. So in fact, the algae oil right here can go into existing refineries, and we can break that into gasoline, jet, and diesel. And in fact, Sapphire, in January of last year, flew a Continental Airlines jet. They powered one of the engines on a 50-50 blend of biofuels and normal jet aircraft. They drove a Prius from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. last year on diesel, swapped the engine out, and drove it back on gasoline. So from algae, we have already made all of the fungible fuels, all of the fuels we need. We've made gasoline, we've made diesel, we've made jet. So we can do it. There's no biological mystery of whether we can do it or not. The mystery is, can we actually drive the economics of this, and can we make it even come close to competing with petroleum? So here's the algae biofuels production chain. Okay? So we know what we need to do. We know what the steps are. The first is, and this is really where we are right now, is in strain development. So we've gone out, and as I said, there's an enormous diversity of algae out there. Some people estimate there may be 3 million different algal species out there. None of them have been domesticated. Or the ones that have been domesticated, very subtle changes have been made to it. So we're actually right now out there just looking around, many people in this country and worldwide, trying to find the best possible strain. The best possible strain means ones that grow quick and produce a fair amount of lipid. The second thing we're going to have to look at is what are the inputs: CO2, water, nutrients, and sunlight. Nutrients, obviously, I believe, are going to be the most important. So not only did we hit something called peak oil, believe it or not, we actually hit something called peak phosphate. So phosphate is a key fertilizer that's required for all agriculture. It's going to be required for algae as well. Where do we get phosphate from right now? We mine it, right? We produce about 40 billion tons per year worldwide. That number is going down. That is going to be a key input. Ultimately, I think the only way we get any crop plant to really act as a fuel source is we've got to find a way to do nutrient recycling. When we get to the end here and we've extracted the fuel away from the algae, what we have left over are all the proteins and carbohydrates. Those are loaded with nitrogen and phosphate. We're going to have to somehow get those back into the system. Now, there are some ways that we can do that. We can do anaerobic digestion. We can take methane gas off that, which are left over with a sludge, which is loaded with nitrogen and phosphate, and we can put it back in. Okay? So I think there's an opportunity to do that. Algae, like any other plant, like any other crop, this is an energy crop. And what that means is if you look at the lessons from agriculture, the next thing that's going to get us is crop protection. When we grow these things at really large scale, when we get them to grow fast and when we load them full of fat, they become little candies and everybody else out there wants to eat them. And in fact, we know from the ponds that we've already launched in New Mexico and in Texas from a couple of different companies, crop protection is the #1 problem. After about 6 or 8 weeks, somebody shows up and starts eating your guy. This is the same problem in agriculture. They spend most of their energy trying to figure out how to protect their crops. If we can get the nutrients solved and we can get crop protection going, then harvesting is the most energetically expensive part right now. We grow algae in water. It takes an enormous amount of energy to pump water around. We've got to find ways to dewater these guys, to get the algae out of the water. Fortunately, there are some very clever ideas to do this, right? And we'll talk about a couple of them later on. And then the final thing is we need co-products. In all of agriculture, you never sell a single product and have a waste stream. If you do that, that simply doesn't drive the economics, right? The expression in pigs is they sell everything but the oink. And so we've got to do the same thing in algae as well. Once we extract the fuel out of it, we have to do something with that residual biomass, either animal feeds, as I said, anaerobic digestion to get more energy out of it, or here we might express some proteins that have a much higher value than the fuel itself, and so the fuel becomes a co-product, and I'll tell you some of those that we've made. So as I said, we have a pretty good idea of what the economics of this are going to be. And so what we plotted here are sort of the different phases of developing an algae biofuel industry, and what those are. And then plotted below this is the price of petroleum under two different scenarios. This is just sort of stays as it is and goes with inflation. And this is, oh, we really are running out of the stuff and the price gets driven up. And here's the price of the fuel price of fuel produced from algae as it goes. Right now, as I said, we're in the bioprospecting and the bioengineering phase. We're someplace along in here sort of developing these things. We're just starting to develop the breeding and selection protocols, and we're starting to think about the co-products. But each one of these, as we develop them, will drive the price down. Now, at what point the price of fuel produced from algae crosses over with the price of petroleum greatly depends upon what that price of petroleum is. We've got a pretty good idea that we're going to sort of bottom out, that we're not going to be able to drive the price below about $2 a gallon. But I'm pretty confident, just from looking at the statistics on how much oil we have left, that we're not going to have to worry about that one bit. That the price of gasoline is going to be well above $6 or $8 a gallon by the time the economy recovers. All right, so what I'm really saying is that what we need to do in algae over the next 10 years is we need to do domestication of that and turn this thing into a bioenergy crop. All of our agriculture is driven this way. This happens to be the domestication of corn. It's taken a little while longer than 10 years. It took about 7,000 years of breeding and selection to get us where we are today. But this is what a corn originally looked like. This is teosinte. It's the wild corn that comes from South America. Oh, and over several thousand years of selection and breeding down there, they got it to look something like this. And then over the last couple hundred years, we turned it into this. And this is what allows us to feed the world. If we did not have corn and we did not have the agricultural efficiencies that we've introduced over the last 100 years, we would not have 6.6 billion people alive on this planet. One of the other alarming things that I think people have really sort of missed in this whole energy debate is as we run out of petroleum for our cars, we're also running out of petroleum to make fertilizer. So the productivity of corn has actually dropped the last 3 years. Not because farmers got lazy or because our breeding technique suddenly went down. It's because the price of fertilizer got high enough that farmers elected not to put it on their crop, so the yield went down a little bit. And they simply accepted a small drop in yield without the big expense of fertilizer. Right? So this is coming too, and this is one thing that we're going to have to deal with. Okay? So no commercial system uses a wild-type organism. We're going to have to do the same thing with algae. This is actually a plot that I stole from DuPont. This actually shows the increase in corn yields over the last 100 years. Now, for the longest time, corn yields were pretty steady in this country. All right? In the 1930s, what happened is we started to do selective breeding and introduce agricultural practices. So irrigation, tilling, high-density corn planting, et cetera. And that really dramatically improved the yields. And then over the last 30 years, we've gone into the molecular sciences, whether that's breeding or now molecular genetics, and that has also driven. The combination of all these things resulted in a 7-fold yield increase in corn over the last 80 years. I believe we will see the same thing in algae. Right? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go out and find source genes. As I said, we have a fantastic diversity for this out there. Then through engineering and breeding and genetics, we're going to have to introduce these traits into production strains. We don't know what the production strains are yet. We have some pretty good ideas. They're probably going to have to be salt-tolerant strains because we're not going to have enough fresh water to do this. And then we're going to have to go out and do the industrial practices, get the harvesting apparatus, get the fuel extraction, et cetera. But I'm fully confident that we can do those things. As I said, this is simply shows the diversity of algae out there. And just for comparison, the only reason I put this slide on right here is, here's the diversity between Homo sapiens and the worm C. elegans. So if you plotted their genomes and compared these things, that's how close they'd be. I like to think I'm very different than a worm. So I'd like to think that that's pretty far apart on an evolutionary scale. Here's red algae, here's cyanobacteria, here's brown algae, an enormous diversity. And in fact, all of the agriculture companies have now figured this out. They've all approached us, and I'm sure many of the other algae guys over the last few years, because what they figured out is there's an enormous diversity of genetic traits out here that we may be able to mine from algae and actually introduce into our terrestrial crops to improve the efficiencies on those. And as I said, as we run out of petroleum, as we run out of fertilizer, that's going to be something that's essential. Okay, so let me briefly tell you now what we've actually done in this little guy. So the good news about algae is it's capable of very rapid genetic improvements. So the way we do this right now is we plate algae on a little plate, we put DNA onto gold particles, we shoot them in there. So we transform these guys, and within about 10 days, transgenic lines are up and growing, and they've integrated the recombinant gene. It takes a little while longer to get those lines what we call homoplasmic, meaning that every copy of the genome has the recombinant gene in it, so at about 6 weeks. So it's somewhere around 6 weeks' time, we can either go to scale up, and within another few months, we can go from a single transformation event to millions of gallons of algae growing in culture if we want, or at this point, we can go through and start doing breeding, selection, high-throughput screening, et cetera. So that, I think, this whole process and the high-throughput technologies that have been developed for the biopharmaceutical industry over the last 20 years, as well as the sequencing technology